welcome to this fireside reading of Dracula, read to you by me, Count Dracula. Actually, it's read to you by me, Gildart Jackson, but I love this book, and I very much hope that you enjoy it too. This is a copy of the very first edition of Dracula. It was written in 1897 by Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker was a part-time writer. He did write 18 books, but most of the time he was the manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London. But this one book of his has become one of the greatest works of English literature. It is an epistolary, which means that it's written as if it were true writings from the time, sort of like a found footage movie, a found footage novel with diary entries, letters, newspaper articles from the day. And it begins with the writings of Jonathan Harker, a solicitor who is writing in his diary and writing to his betrothed, Wilhelmina Mina Murray, who fast becomes one of my favourite characters in the book. This book has been made into 30 movies or more, television shows, radio plays, and this, I think, is its very first fireside reading. Fireside reading is a whole new way to look at books. And with Dracula, we are doing something a little differently from the way we've done it before, because Dracula, as written by Bram Stoker, is a very long book. And so a fireside friend, Cassara Meek, has edited and abridged the book down to be able to fit the fireside reading format. I do hope that you enjoy this fireside reading of Dracula by Bram Stoker, read to you by me, Gildart Jackson. Dracula by Bram Stoker. Chapter 1. Jonathan Harker's Journal. 3rd of May, Bistreets. It was on the dark side of twilight when we got to Bistreets, which is a very interesting old place. Count Dracula had directed me to go to the Golden Crone Hotel, which I found, to my great delight, to be thoroughly old-fashioned, for of course I wanted to see all I could of the ways of the country. I was evidently expected, for when I got near the door I faced a cheery-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress, white undergarment with long double apron front and back, of coloured stuff fitting almost too tight for modesty. When I came close, she bowed and presented me with a letter. My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 3 tomorrow, the diligence will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass, my carriage will await you and will bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula. 4th of May. I found that my landlord had got a letter from the Count directing him to secure the best place on the coach for me. He and his wife, the old lady who had received me, looked at each other in a frightened sort of way. He mumbled out that the money had been sent in a letter, and that was all he knew. When I asked him if he knew Count Dracula, and could tell me anything of the castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying that they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak further. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said, in a very hysterical way, "Must you go? Oh, young hare, must you go? Do you know what day it is?" I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head as she said again, "Oh, yes, I know that, but do you know what day it is?" On my saying that I did not understand, she went on, "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what you are going to?" Upon my insistence on going, she took a crucifix from her neck and offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as an English churchman, I have been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous, and yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well and in such a state of mind. She saw, I suppose, the doubt in my face, for she put the rosary round my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," and went out of the room. 5th of May, the castle. The grey of the morning has passed, and the sun is high over the distant horizon. When we started, the crowd round the inn door, which had by this time swelled to a considerable size, all made the sign of the cross and pointed 2 fingers towards me. With some difficulty I got a fellow passenger to tell me what they meant. He would not answer at first. He explained that it was a charm or guard against the evil eye. As we wound on our endless way, the sun sank lower and lower behind us. The shadows of the evening began to creep round us. When it grew dark, there seemed to be some excitement among the passengers, and they kept speaking to our driver, one after the other, as though urging him to further speed. Each moment I expected to see the glare of lamps through the blackness, but all was dark. We could see now the sandy road lying white before us, but there was on it no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had best do when the driver, looking at his watch, said to the others something which I could hardly hear, it was spoken so quietly and in so low a tone. I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then, turning to me, he said in German worse than my own, "There is no carriage here. The Herr is not expected after all. He will now come on to Bukowina and return tomorrow or the next day. Better the next day." Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants and a universal crossing of themselves, a calèche with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps as the rays fell on them that the horses were coal black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight as he turned to us. He said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend." The man stammered in reply, "The English Herr was in a hurry," to which the stranger replied, "That is why I suppose you wished him to go on to Bukovina." "You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth, with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth, as white as ivory. "Give me the Herr's luggage," said the driver, and with exceeding alacrity my bags were handed out and put in the caleche. Then I descended from the side of the coach. As the caleche was close alongside, the driver helping me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel, his strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he shook his reins, the horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the pass. I felt a strange chill, and a lonely feeling came over me, but a cloak was thrown over my shoulders and a rug across my knee, and the driver said in excellent German, "The night is chill, mein Herr, and my master, the Count, bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of plum brandy underneath the seat if you should require it." I did not take any, but it was a comfort to know it was there all the same. The carriage went at a hard pace, straight along. Then we made a complete turn and went along another straight road. It seemed to me that we were simply going over and over the same ground again, and so I took note of some salient point and found that this was so. I was curious to know how time was passing. I struck a match and by its flame looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, for I suppose the general superstition about midnight was increased by my recent experiences. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in a farmhouse far down the road, a long, agonized wailing, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another, and another, till borne on the wind, which now sighed softly through the pass, a wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it through the gloom of the night. Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of us, began a louder and a sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way. For I was minded to jump from the caleche and run, whilst they reared again and plunged madly, so that the driver had to use all his great strength to keep them from bolting. Suddenly, away on our left, I saw a faint flickering blue flame. The driver saw it at the same moment. He at once checked the horses and, jumping to the ground, disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to do. the less as the howling of the wolves grew closer. But while I wondered, the driver suddenly appeared again and without a word took his seat, and we resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly. And now, looking back, it is like a sort of awful nightmare. Then for a time there were no blue flames, and we sped onwards through the gloom, with the howling of the wolves around us, as though they were following in a moving circle. At last there came a time when the driver went further afield than he had yet gone in search of the light, and during his absence the horses began to tremble worse than ever, and to snort and scream with fright. I saw around us a ring of wolves with white teeth and lolling red tongues, with long sinewy limbs and shaggy hair. They were 100 times more terrible in the grim silence which held them than even when they howled. For myself, I felt a sort of paralysis of fear. All at once, the wolves began to howl as though the moonlight had had some peculiar effect on them. The horses jumped about and reared and looked helplessly round with eyes that rolled in a way painful to see. But the living ring of terror encompassed them on every side, and they had perforce to remain with it. Suddenly, I heard the coachman's voice raised in a tone of imperious command, and looking towards the sound, saw him stand in the roadway. As he swept his long arms as though brushing aside some impalpable obstacle, the wolves fell back, and back still further. Just then, a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, so that we were again in darkness. When I could see again, the driver was climbing into the caleche, and the wolves had disappeared. This was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me, and I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept on our way, now in almost complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. We kept on ascending, with occasional periods of quick descent, but in the main always ascending. Suddenly I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast, ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky.